Hi, this is Tim of the WatchBox at Dubai Watch Week 2021 with the collector and social media phenomenon, Shawn. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure, Tim. Thank you for having me, and I'm a big fan of your work.
Now, explain to me, because we come to watches at different ages by different means, and we all have our own journey to relate. Tell me the tale of how you came to find a passion for watches.
So my passion into watches, I'm ever grateful for my late stepfather for bringing me into the watchmaking fold and for teaching me a lot of I would call it the base of the pyramid, the foundation. So he instilled that into me in about 2014 when we visited a fine factory that happened to be FB Jaune together for the very first time. And so I went into that factory visit not knowing anything about watches. And I left that factory with one goal, was to one day own a Jaune. And I could say I'm blessed that my parents gave me a watch for my 18th birthday, and that sparked the entire interest in watches. And unfortunately, the 18th birthday came before the factory visit. Not that they would have gifted me a Jaune, so that's all right. But and then so from there, my interest spiked in watches, and it's been part of my daily life ever since, and I'm blessed to have had that tour and that experience back then.
So early on, you became a collector, buying the watches that were available at the price you were interested in early on at the time. But over time, you set your sights higher and you cultivated a taste that is probably, I would say, favoring independence. And how did you cultivate that specific taste from the beginning? Did you start with Omega and Rolex and then move to Indies, or did you just decide, I'm going to hold out until I can get what I really want?
Sure. So following the family tradition, so to say, 13, 18 are the two big milestones in our short lives back then. So we would always be encouraged at 13 to maybe look and seek a mechanical watch for about 1,000 or 2,000 euros. And so I always held out, and I said, I'll wait till I'm 18, and by then maybe I'll know a bit more. And again, it's from a very fortunate place that our parents, my brother and I, that they gifted us a watch. And so my journey started with an offshore a pre-owned offshore that I frankly didn't know much about. And after that factory tour, my entire vision of the watchmaking industry was leaning in favor of the independence. And it was just that overwhelming joy of being able to sit down and ask a watchmaker certain questions. I mean, back in 2014 up until 17, you could pretty much ask any watchmaker any questions. The tides hadn't changed yet in favor of the independence. So it was a different world. Whatever you wanted to see was available to see, whatever questions you had. Now it's a bit more reserved with everything that's gone on. So we could say I got in at the right time, and the collection pivoted from the big brands into the independents back then from a very early age. So
now, Francois Paul Jaune does seem to be your sentimental favorite, but could you walk us through some of the different independents that have held your interest over the years? I think Francois Paul is well known to our audience.
Sure.
Were there smaller names that you also found compelling?
I mean, so as my collecting journey has gone on, and not in the watch dealing side of things, more in a personal capacity, these young creators coming on board, and we're approximately the same age, and so you can ask them a bunch of questions. So someone that I followed closely and with a loop, so to say, is Remy Coules. I've been fascinated by his work, and other independents. I've always held some fascination for Vianney Altair. I think he's produced some of the most, from a design perspective, some of the most interesting and compelling cases out there. And when you lose that traditional round case and you go into, you enter a different world, and then you fall into this new basket. You have Urwerk, you have Debutune that have different case styles, and they're completely against the traditional side of watchmaking, it's beautiful. I would say there's a facet for everyone in the independent sphere.
And I do appreciate that you mentioned Remy Coules, because a lot of folks don't realize that Francois Paul sponsors an award for young watch and clock makers, and that there's a continuous selection and sort of a pedigree being produced by this competition as these people receive recognition and then sort of stake out their own claim to the watch world. Could you talk a little bit about this competition, because it's not well understood?
Sure. I mean, it's one of the many competitions that there are out there. I think it's one of the ones that propel, and this is François Paul and the Hourglass giving back to the industry in their own way. I mean, they've done their circle of life. They're reputable. They're recognized, and so here they have it's every year they have a submission date that you have to submit your project, and it should be a working prototype. They don't like CAD drawings and a non-physical prototype. So, and then they're invited to present it, and there's a panel of judges that then assess what they favor and what they're looking for. And the most beautiful thing is that they give them a bit of experience too. They're invited to come in and have an apprenticeship in the factory, and then after that they're given a budget for their tools if they need certain machinery, or if they ever need any help. I think the factory will always keep a vigilant eye, and so will the Hourglass, on their progression, and if they can play a part and role, they will. And so that's one side of it, and then there are other brands that do it too. So it's beautiful to see this circle of life coming back and giving back to the young guys, which is otherwise you could say it'd be very tough to launch a brand today without any of that recognition. Especially for a young 20-something-year-old to come about, and we've innovated as much as we can, and to expect a young guy with no means to innovate from the get-go can be very tough. So it's beautiful to see all in.
And it is challenging. Francois Paul made his first watch in 1983. He wasn't making them under his own name until 1999. So even with all the talent in the world, without that helping hand, it could take decades.
Sure.
Now, you are a collector, but you are also a dealer, and you've sort of made your love your life. Your profession is your passion. How do you separate Shawn the collector from Shawn the dealer, or are they one and the same?
Well, that's a great question, and with experience and maturity, I've been able to split the two. Before, my stepfather used to call me the greatest collector, non-dealer out there, because I would buy and just hoard and keep them, and he said at some point you need to, if this is your passion and if this is the field you'd like to pursue, you have to start selling. And the first one hurt. The very first deal was from the private collection, so to say. So the first one was it felt like a nasty breakup to an extent. It was, which one should I pick and which one should I let go of? And there's no right or wrong answer. I mean, you'll always regret it. But what he planted in my brain back then was to always have a core focus in the collection. So the collection has a dedicated focus. We have long-term, short-term goals that we'd like to knock down on the checklist. And on the other hand, on the dealing side is, I'm extremely grateful to many friends and colleagues in the industry for spurring my knowledge and just letting me have a chance in this rather, it can be overwhelming at times. I mean, when you're a little guy that's not really raised capital and you're coming on and competing in the independents, which is an extremely hot market today, it can always be, it's always interesting, but the beauty of the trade is if your gut ever buys incorrectly, you could then potentially place that in the private collection for the time being. And it's something that's happened once between us. I bought something that was far too expensive as a dealer, and I said, well, I know the market will change at some point for this certain independent, and I'm willing to see his progression, and I'm willing to wait. And not many businesses can afford to take such risks. If we had external shareholders and pressure, I would have probably been told to sell it. So it does have its perks of being small and independent, and with platforms such as yourselves and others, you learn something every day. That's the beauty of this, being involved in the trade.
It really is a lot of fun to work in watches full time, but there are challenges. Could you share some of the challenges you've faced as a collector or mistakes you've made as a dealer? Lessons that our viewers can learn from someone who's been there and done that.
Sure. So on the collector side, I would say that having no focus is extremely dangerous. I mean, everyone will go through trials and tribulations of trying to put together a collection, And I got to this stage where the business was going well and I had the surplus to invest into the private collection. And at one point, there were a couple of watches on the table, and I kept asking myself, where are we going with this? And some people collect in a pyramid, so they have their base collection and then they go after that grail. And that forms the part of the pinnacle of the pyramid. And mine, I would say, is if you compare it to, I probably started building 4 pyramids, and there would be no pinnacle, there'd be no, and so it just took a little bit of self-reflection and knowing where I'd like to go, and to tell you the definite end goal, I don't know it right in this particular moment, but I'm extremely happy and pleased to see that the collection is well-rounded now. Not to focus on any one single independent watchmaker, and I'd love to, going back to that circle of life, I'd love to give the chance back to the younger guys that are coming on board and supporting them. If François Paul and other independents, Dufour, didn't have their patrons back in the day, it would have been extremely tough for them to reach where they are today. So I don't call myself a patron because I don't have the means to really buy someone's base collection, but if I can play a small part and be part of the history, I'm more than happy to do so on the personal end of things.
Without a doubt, and it's a fast-moving world. Just, I would say 36 months ago, independents were getting hot, but they weren't red hot. How has the market for independent brands, not just Journe, but all of them, changed in the last 3 years? And part of that is the pandemic period.
Sure, no, so I mean, it's, if you go back through my WhatsApp chats in 2018-17, I was advocating several independents, and I kept telling my friends and clients alike that you should at least try and get 1 or 2 in your collection, and all of them would laugh and say, you know, these are too quirky, what is this? This is another world, I mean, I can't even tell the time. And they were collecting mainstream, so to say, and to watch the tides shift from the large institutional brands, I would say, that are group backed, and flow into the independent sector, it's just been probably one of the most beautiful things you could ever see in your lifetime. And I go back to the art world to a degree, and I say that most artists, important ones, their works are recognized during their lifetime, but once they pass, do they have this resurgence and people want them, since none will be produced anymore? And so independent watchmaking is a relatively new concept. I mean, if we go back to George Daniels and his time, it's beautiful to see that they're recognized in their lifetime and they can enjoy it too. I mean, some of them are indifferent to it, and others appreciate the recognition. And we're all part of this journey. And I think the entire market where it's at today, I think it's a byproduct of them innovating and offering, I would say, some sort of value proposition along the way. I mean, they've always competed, they've always been there, and now that the spotlight is on them, it's beautiful to see them thrive, and I think it's here to stay. I don't see things changing anytime soon. I think people have become somewhat bored with the complacency of certain brands in the mainstream, and so that's my view on that.
And it is true that some watchmakers don't get the full recognition they deserve in their lifetime. The one that stands out the most to me was Derek Pratt.
Yes.
And I would even say that Roger Dubuis didn't live long enough to realize how much people would come to appreciate his original Sogem era 1990s watches.
Yes.
So if they had lived in the era of social media, and both of them hit their peaks somewhat before that, they probably would have been celebrities. What has social media done to change the scope of interest in watches and maybe the temperature in the room, so to speak, the intensity of interest in certain watches?
Sure. So social media is an interesting, I call it a vicious world for several reasons, but in terms of the positivity that it brings to the industry, it opens up doors. And before, you had the retailer at the core nucleus of the industry, and now the retailer finds himself on the periphery, on the outskirts of everything. And a simple phone and an Instagram page could essentially sell watches today. And so a lot of the hurdles that these independents faced are no longer there thanks to Instagram, forums. And I'd say that Instagram has just fueled the fire to a degree. And when certain influencers or someone like that tags a brand, or it causes this rupture, and certain brands that have been somewhat dormant and not had the fair recognition, it's a pity. And then Instagram, if Instagram was around when Debris' time was there, and Derek Pratt, which I'd like to see if his legacy is honored in the projects that will come out, or hopefully. But I think if Instagram was around during their era, I wonder how things would have changed for them. And then again, if we go back to shipping and next day delivery and all that didn't exist back then either. So there are some constraints, but it's a beautiful tool in today's industry, and the barriers to entry for a dealer also are remarkably low thanks to social media, Instagram and other platforms alike. And I joke with a lot of my friends that every day there's a new dealer in town, and if you're not known for something, and that's why we've predominantly focused on independence, where we could be known for everything and then be rather insignificant. And that's something that scares me to a degree, to just be a fly on the wall and sell anything and everything. I'd rather focus on things that we truly appreciate and vouch for at the end of the day.
Now, I've noticed two trends that have arisen in the market. The first is that it doesn't seem as though vintage is driving markets as much as it used to. There's a move towards a combination of mass-produced watches, like the ones you would get from Rolex, a great interest in that, and also a move towards independents who are, for the most part, still alive. Do you see vintage waning as a force in the market, particularly at the auction level, or is it still equally potent?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and it's twofold. On the one hand, the vintage world, it's a minefield to begin with, and when you buy a watch, they sell you the beauties of period correct, end links, and all this. And when you go to the sell side, you could be surprised with what you actually find out about your watches. So you really have to do your homework, and you have to be drilled and disciplined in collecting vintage. And I don't think vintage is it could be waning in terms of the overall, if we split auction catalogs and check the vintage versus the neo-contemporary, so to say, you could see that the vintage levels are, the revenues might be coming down, but it boils down to the pieces that are presented at auctions. Today, with social media, there are people that are scholars that will call out any nonsense at the auction level, which didn't exist many years ago. And so it's interesting to see that I think the top vintage and very historically important and in all original or somewhat all original condition will always thrive. But I feel that everything that got clubbed with that will have its ups and downs, and I think potentially it's on the downward slope. And the independents and the others, for example, a Jaune dial. How many loose dials have you seen of a Jaune in the open market? So that gives you the reassurance, and they're living legends. And so to say, I mean, you could go to any of the watchmakers and ask them, is this dial original, yes or no? And they'll be able to tell you point blank. If it was changed at some point, they'll tell you at this juncture of its lifetime it was changed. And so that transparency is there in the independent and this whole side of the world. Whereas in the vintage, people sell you what they want to sell, and we've had some experience in the vintage world. We've had some pieces consigned now and then, and it just ends up being. I mean, we feel extremely sorry for the clients that have bought pieces that weren't advertised as they were, and then when they go on the sell side, it becomes extremely tricky. So that's my view on the entire scope there.
So if you're going vintage, high dollar or low, do your homework and find someone who knows. Quick question, second major trend. Maybe this isn't a quick question.
Sure.
But I've seen that, because I write investor reports about where the Swiss watch exports are going, I know that a lot of the previous major markets have been eclipsed, and we're now at a point where the US and mainland China pretty much alternate month after month as the top market for Swiss exports. Now, you would deal with both markets, but do you find that they want different things? Like, is there a different kind of collector in China versus the collector in the United States and what they're playing for?
Sure. I mean, we've noticed that in the independents, the U.S. has always been at the forefront of that entire adaptation. So from going from the mainstream brands into the independents, I think most independent brands, the ones that are still around today, are extremely thankful for the patronage that they receive from the entire America. I would say Americas, but that's not accurate. It'd just be North America. I'd say it's predominantly thanks to the collectors that had the intuition and the foresight of what independent watchmaking would become. And then you have its sibling on the other side of the world, not siblings. I mean, so you have them on the other side of the world, and they're playing catch up to a degree. So they weren't always receptive, and they didn't understand. But now the scales might be tipping in favor of the American collectors have done it, and they know exactly what they're looking for. And then on the other side of the world, you have this whole new young generation coming into the independent watchmaking world, and they're just looking for something that pleases them. And so I guess you could say I wouldn't say behind. I'd say it's funny how the trends in certain countries occur before, and then you have other markets that then pick up. And I'd say that a lot of the most important independent watches that came up at auction recently, it seemed that a lot of them went to the Far East. At Only Watch 2, it seemed that there was a burning desire to have something extremely important and historically significant. And it's interesting because sometimes you show them older vintage, I would say somewhat vintage independent watchmaking, and it's quite an interesting. If you were to draw a profile, they tell you, let me start with the modern first and then get into the vintage. And whereas the American collector has collected the vintage back when it was the modern, and now they're slowly progressing into the modern. So it's quite an interesting way that the collectors collect to a degree.
Are we going to have to change the way we think about vintage? For example, is a 1990s Philippe Dufour duality or a 1999 subscription Tourbillon Remontoir from F.P. Journe, or a 1996 Homage perpetual calendar from Roger Dubuis, are these truly vintage watches, or do we need a different way of thinking about older watches by independent brands?
I mean, it's a great question, and at the end of the day, it's subjective. I think it boils down to who you ask and what their view is. I think beyond my lifetime, these will all definitely be vintage. so they'll all be deemed as vintage. But I see those in the 1990s, I see those being, I would club them as vintage today, and I would go all the way up to 2001. And that's my view on just the significance of that era alone and what it brought to the industry back then is just, I mean, that was almost Renaissance-like in terms of you had George Daniels that did it long ago, and then there was this significant gap between you had the Roths, you had the Roger Dubuis come up after, and I would deem all their early work that predates 2001 to be somewhat vintage. And I think at the end of the day, in auction catalogs and in our descriptions, and maybe yours alike, they'd probably be considered neo-vintage to a degree, or classic contemporary turn of the century watchmaking. And so, yeah, it's subjective at the end of the day, according to me.
Maybe that's the new term for early independent work from the 80s and the 90s. Neoclassic. It's not vintage, it's not modern, it's neoclassic. I'll give you full credit for that.
No.
So when Urwerk first exhibited at the Basel show, when I don't think it was Basel World in 1997.
Yeah.
Okay, I was 13 years old.
Okay.
Today, if I wanted, I could go out and buy an Urwerk, in theory. So there's definitely a generational shift going on as the baby boomers leave the market. Maybe they're not all gone, but they're leaving. They're on fixed incomes, they've conquered every Everest, they've collected their trophies, and they're done with that. Have you seen a turnover in the generation and the age of the collector who's coming to you looking for Journe, looking for Urwerk, for MB&F, for De Bethune?
Yeah, so I'd say that the average client buying those pieces are sub 35 today. And it's increasingly interesting to note the youngest collector on our platform would be about 24, and he's gone after some fairly significant journes in his collection, and it boils down to who. It's tough to say exactly who comes. There's no set age or anything like that, but it's more to do with who has the capabilities also. And I always summarize this to the important independents today. If I were a young collector that got into the market today, there's probably nothing more daunting than going after independence, because most of, as you said, back then at Basel World or Basel Show, back then you could meet the watchmaker, ask them, place your order, or through a retailer or there was a door that could be opened at all times. And today you find these young collectors that the door doesn't even have a knob, and you can't even, you're just at the door, you have the means, you're willing to buy, and there's just no one that will really...
It's opaque, in other words.
Exactly, and it becomes, and sometimes they come to us somewhat upset and then share some experiences at boutiques, and ultimately we're there to first and foremost educate. So if we can give them some guidance and say, listen, the modern ones are great, but in your works, for example, they're early 103s, 102s, I mean, they're...
The Sputniks, the Millennium Falcons.
Exactly. I mean, some of those up until, I would say, 16 weeks ago, they were relatively affordable, and they were beautiful. They were beautiful pieces in their own right. So.
And the world is big. There are some watchmakers that are not recognized. Thomas Engel, Derek Pratt, David Walter, no one's talking about them. Learn about them and you'll be happy you did. Those are opportunities too for people who have a sufficient level of awareness. So where do you get this awareness? What resources do up-and-coming collectors who have the means but not the knowledge, what resources do they have to educate themselves?
Well, at Tim Mosso on Instagram. No, so...
and you've got an Instagram handle too, let's promote that.
Yes, I do too. No, so there's a... It depends, the quirkier and the more unknown the watchmaker is, the more difficult it is to amass that information on this particular person. But the beauty about this industry is you could go to anyone that's been in the industry to an extent and always ask and prod along and ask those questions. And they could sometimes refer you to someone and say, well, why don't you speak to this person? He used to be his right-hand man, or something along the lines of that. And then from there, you organically extricate that information, and whether you'd like to publish an article or something of that nature, you're more than welcome to. But I think social media, forums, blogs, old auction catalogs are remarkably informative. They're quite. It's always funny to see the estimates back then, and what really the last Philips auction, there was the Urban Jurgensen pocket watch, and so I wound that watch. I had read about it quite a fair amount, and I just left it on the desk, and the escape, the tourbillon in there. It didn't have the escapement of Pratt on that one. I mean, it didn't have the remontoir that he usually put. I think there were 6 and 6 or 12 in total, or something of that nature. And just to hear it purr, and to think back in the day it was made with the tools that he had and the resources that he had, and just to be able to hear that tick-tock was enough for me. I did bid, I was unsuccessful, but just that encounter with that watch. And then from that, you start reading more and more about him, and you'd love to know more and see what the next opportunity could be. And so there's plentiful of information out there. It's just about doing your homework and your research, and whether you're willing to do it. Many people, frankly speaking, skim the surface and then retract and go back into their bunker and claim. We have many self-proclaimed experts today, so it's...
Yeah, the thing that scares me the most is the self-proclaimed vintage Rolex expert.
Yes.
That's outside the bounds of this conversation.
Sure.
No, so let's talk about controversy now. Not
Sure.
too controversial, but let's start with this new project from Grubel Forsey, Renaissance d'une montre.
Sure.
The idea that you can take a watch from 2005, the very first double tourbillon 30 degree. You want a black dial? Fine. You want to change the color of the font? Fine. You want to add a date? Fine. I mean, what do you feel? How do you feel about changing historical pieces in the spur of the moment on a whim for a subsequent owner?
Not fine. No. So I mean, if we delve into it a bit more, I think it's an interesting value proposition for an owner of such a piece. I think that the Grubel audience is, I don't know many collectors that would buy 10 Grubels, for example. You possibly go after 2 or 3, depending on the person. And so I think this is catered towards the one watch Grubel owner. And if he or she gets somewhat tired of the overall complication, it's great to know that they don't have to. I don't know the exact pricing, and I don't know the exact. I'm sure it's catered to the individual and based on the dial and the complication upgrade. I'd like to know what the difference is between buying that exact same reference outright, and that'll be interesting to compare between the two. And not only that, I feel that I don't know what it'll do to their pre-owned market between us. I think it's a very interesting concept. Hats off to them for going through with it and presenting it. But in terms of the pre-owned market, I don't know what that does to the overall Grubel market. And I feel that instead of having classics from, let's say, the early 2000s when they started, and to know that they could be somewhat tweaked, or I mean, I wonder the provenance of that certain piece. I mean, how would you
do you even document the changes?
Exactly. I mean, how will this all happen? So I think it'll be great to see once it comes out and see the overall impact of that service. And ultimately, we've seen it with micro brands in the past that you could have some sort of customization or change things. But I think it's the first time we see an artisanal watchmaker offer this level of personalization and configurations at the end of the day. And let's see where it goes. It's interesting for sure. I'm not sure what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit like these electric conversions of classic Jaguars and Aston Martins. I'm okay with it if you keep all the parts and it can be reverted. And with the Grubel, I would want the whole process documented, and again, the original parts kept, maybe even in Le Chaux de Fonds at the factory, so it could be reverted. I feel like the historical fabric is worth more than the whim of the moment. It strikes me as a bit of a revenue source more than a real statement of capability, but you know, that's just my opinion.
Sure.
Now, scarcity. Philippe Dufour and Claude Sapphire have found a compelling solution to the problem of choosing who gets what. Half of the 20 available pieces of the Simplicity 20th anniversary will be sold off to various VIP customers, and then 10, the other half, will be sold, but the winners of a lottery will gain the right to purchase. This seems very fair. Would you like to see something more like this used to allot inventory from independents?
So Mr. Sphere is he was one of the influences in my early journey in the industry, and ever thankful for all his support and guidance. And so I actually spoke to him about it not long ago to understand the procedure, and he said, Shawn, if I open the Gmail account and keep scrolling, you'd be stunned with the amount of people. And that's back when there was no known retail price for the watch. So they had over 1,000 requests, and I think it's the most autocratic and fair way to potentially not get involved in nitpicking and favoring certain regions over others. And yes, I'd love to see more and more of that. Then again, those 10, let's say you're their 11th best client, I mean, you'd be hard felt when you so you'd always disappoint someone. It'd be interesting, either you go fully towards the...
yeah, maybe you don't pick favorites, you just lottery all 20.
Exactly. Or you have two lottery. It's interesting. It's a fair strategy, and I think it gives everyone the hope that you need in pursuing such a piece. I mean, if the door's closed again with no door handle, it can be quite annoying. So I think it does give everyone a fair chance and opportunity to own such a piece. So glad to see it done, and hopefully it transcends into the other brands and other pieces in the future.
I mean, as small as Philippe Dufour and as big as Rolex, I would love to see something like that. Purchase priority by lottery, everyone has a chance. Another issue, a controversial one, I'm keeping with the theme here.
Yes.
Service. It's the worst part of owning a watch, and the independents in particular have a reputation for being slow and idiosyncratic when a watch has to go back to be fixed or just overhauled. What should be done in this space, and is anyone leading on this front?
I mean, so servicing is the, how can I say it politely? Servicing is the unloved child of the industry to an extent, and we shouldn't forget that it is a serious revenue maker for many brands. And it is a shame that there isn't a clear and, I mean, think about it this way. When you have a package delivered to your house, you can trace it through and through. So you can see once it's left.
If you buy a $5 product from
Exactly.
Amazon.
I mean, so you can see once it's left the factory, they give you updates throughout its timeline, and once it arrives, you open it and usually you're happy, and if you need to send it back, there's a label or whatever. So in terms of the servicing in the watch industry, it's the most opaque and obscure side of the industry, and it's a shame that there's not more emphasis and focus on that side of things. And I think the power is in the consumer at the end of the day. And certain brands, I've had certain clients that have complained, and the byproduct of awful service and not knowing when your watch is coming back and then being slapped with a huge invoice is that they then are either put off by the brand as a whole, or they get rid of the watch within, once it returns, they could give us a call or a platform like yourselves, and they'd like to just get rid of the watch, and they have no emotional sentiment or attachment to the piece anymore due to a horrible servicing side of things. So I mean, it's a billion-dollar industry in itself. So,
And I've seen the $50,000 service fee for Grand Sonnery. I've seen
Yes.
horror stories. It is very off-putting. And the worst thing is, if you do pay that 50 grand to service Grand Sonnery, you have no idea when it's coming back. Like, it's not even like, okay, I paid the ransom, now I'm going to have this on my terms. You're not.
yes.
So how do you deal with that as a dealer?
I mean, you're always in the Grand Sonnery. It's somewhat more complicated than the ordinary watch. So,
Fair.
I mean, it does entail a lot more.
I've also seen 10,000 for a chronograph. So it can
But I mean, you could not bring that to the average person and ask them to fix it. But where the interesting one is to see, I mean, a lot of brands have service centers across the world, and certain things aren't in their purview, so they're not allowed to open a watch from 2000 this because it has to go back to the headquarters or something like that. And I think that the certain brands could benefit from outsourcing quick servicing, things that are repairable and don't need that entire journey back to the village or anything like that, where it could just be fixed. And I think every independent collector has a watchmaker. And I mean, what I mean by that is they have a go-to guy that could always check something, and provided the screws are, I mean, the standard screwdrivers, or they could make their own also if they're talented enough. And so you always have someone, that a watchmaker that you could always ask and get their opinion on certain things. But I mean, if you ever argue with a servicing invoice and an estimate, you'd pretty much argue with yourself in a mirror, and nothing would.
Once they've got your watch, it's a ransom note.
There's not much you can do. So it's it'll be interesting to see how that side of the industry evolves. And I think ultimately the consumer has the power, but in this hot market we're in, people tend to think watches don't need servicing, and they won't break down anytime soon. So that remains to be seen.
So before we conclude, I want to do two things. First, you've got a lovely watch right here. This is the Zenith SJX collaboration. You might have heard of the poker chip. I know the folks at home want to see you open this.
No, please, I'll let you do the honor.
Are you kidding?
No, please. I've come on here, and
This guy's unbelievable.
That's from a good friend and someone that I've learned an enormous amount of information, and the reason that I know certain watches so well is thanks to my friend SJX. And so I joke with him and I tell him this is probably the only watch I can get without being on a wait list or any of that, and we always have a good laugh. So please do the honors, and
Drum roll.
at some point we should switch off the lights and loom that up.
Oh, we will. My guys are on it. Very nice. Beautifully sized, 200 pieces.
Yes. And it's interesting. It has the same movement as the, I mean, what it was essentially inspired by, the G383, the disco from 1996. So he had the choice to choose the new and updated movement. And
no, the old watch is incredibly weird.
Yeah.
And he went with the classic caliber 400. This is a beautiful watch. We're going to loom this thing up later. But I want our folks at home to know where they can find you. You've got a presence online. You've got a big social media footprint. Run me through the websites and the accounts they need to know.
So the website is watch4moi.com, and the Instagram handle is @watch4moi, Watch4Moi, on Instagram, and that's where you can find us. And happy to answer any questions from this interview, or if anyone disagrees with anything, it'd be great to hear their side of the story.
Shawn, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.